So let's get started. So welcome everyone to what's the fourth bite-sized series for the junior faculty. So today we're going to hear a talk from both Win Young, who's the finance manager for projects, grants and awards, along those lines at GOSH, and John Burt, who's the new finance manager at ICH, who joined in July. So first of all, people who were attended the previous bite-size that was on governance, we promised or mentioned that we'd been developing a animation that would run you through the process of R&D and finance, which Wing and John will talk about. So we're just going to play that for you now as the global premiere. It's an overview process, so there will be some caveats to it whenever you come to do your registration and finances, etc.
Oh, ready for the premiere. Yes.
Meet Sarah. Sarah has a great idea for a research project between Great Ormond Street Hospital and the UCL GOS Institute of Child Health. She really wants her project to make a difference, but where to start and how to get it funded? She's heard it can be a long and daunting process. Luckily, the joint GOSH and ICH R&D office is located on the second floor of the Philip Allman wing at the ICH and is full of very helpful people who are experts at turning research ideas into reality. Sarah's first meeting is with the grants advice team. These people know a thing or two about writing grant applications. They can help Sarah to really nail her ideas and advise her on the process for her research project. For starters, they ask Sarah to think more deeply about her idea. Why is it important? Will any other collaborators be involved? They also help her to identify some possible funders and recommend she speaks with her head of department about the project. Sarah will need their approval when it comes to submitting her application. Grants advice may also suggest she talks to other support services relevant to the project. For instance, the ORCID team, who provide specific advice for nurses, allied health professionals, and other wider healthcare professionals. Sarah decides to meet the patient and public involvement and engagement team, who offer some great advice about incorporating PPIE activities into her proposal and how to make her language more accessible and engaging. Sarah also needs to consider whether she will be using human tissue or patient data, and consider the facilities she may need, such as a clinical trials unit or a clinical research facility. It's good to think about this from the start. Before Sarah can take her project further and submit a grant application, she has to officially register it. To do this, she completes an R&D registration form, answering questions that explore the details of her project, which funder she will apply to, and the resources she'd like to include. It's pretty straightforward, but the R&D registration team is on hand to help. Once her project is registered, Sarah continues preparing her application to the funder. ICH and GOSH finance teams will provide her with costings and help finalize her budget. Sarah uses the internal peer review process to get some helpful feedback on her proposal. Once Sarah is happy, she sends her application for department and organization approval, then crosses her fingers and submits it to the funder. All this effort pays off. After many months of review, the funder loves Sarah's idea and sends her a grant award letter saying they will fund the whole project. She's one of the lucky ones, as many grants don't get funded. Sarah is really excited and throws a party, for research purposes obviously. Before the project kicks off, there are a few more important boxes that need to be ticked. Sarah needs to send her grant award letter to R&D, who will pass her project to the governance team for setup. If her application was unsuccessful, she'd still need to let the R&D team know. The governance setup process looks at the project and ensures that regulations, principles, and standards of good practice are adhered to. This may involve regulatory submissions, such as ethical approval and department capacity checks. A risk assessment will also be needed, so that Sarah can carry out her work safely and responsibly. All that remains before Sarah begins is to dot the I's and cross the T's. the contracts team advisor on what contracts she may need and who must sign them. When all approvals and documentation are in place, which can take several months, governance confirm this with a letter. And now Sarah is ready to go. The ICH and GOSH finance team help her access the funding by setting up grant codes, offer grant management advice, invoicing support, and deal with staff payments throughout the length of the project. Sarah is now busier than ever, needing to carry out the work and regularly report progress to her funder and regulators. And when her project is done, the research communications team are there to help share her story and her findings, so that the project gets the recognition it deserves. We know from experience how daunting it can be to undertake any research project, and the process may differ depending on the nature of the project and who's involved. And that's why we're here to help you take your first step. To find out more about how to take your research idea forward, come and talk to us and visit our website.
So that was just to give you an overview of the entire process. As you can see, there's multiple different elements that need to come together for any grant application. And in that context, John and Wing are going to describe kind of more particulars around the finance side of things. Just a few kind of housekeeping things. This isn't a drop-in session, so please don't have individual project-related questions. Those can be dealt with at other times. And also then there's going to be a networking session after with some drinks and nibbles, which I assume will be on the second floor, first floor, second floor.
Yeah.
So stick around after and have a bit more discussions. Guys, you want to take it away?
Well, after we've had the premiere of the video, which has ever so eloquently described everything, hopefully our presentation will...
much more to add, haven't we?
I know.
Yeah.
I don't know if you need us anymore. Yeah. So basically, we're going to talk about kind of, well, it's all things research, finance, but it's going to be specifically about like the initial stage of the costings. Here are our names in case you need them again. My title is a bit of a mouthful, just FYI. So these are some of the most common types of questions that we do see from researchers, and hopefully the aim of the session is try to basically kind of clarify on these, and then obviously we'll have a Q&A at the end if we haven't quite gone through something for you to ask these questions. Yeah, so firstly we're going to start talking about the pre-award, so before you get the award and what happens, and then obviously we'll flow through into what happens after.
Okay. So yeah, we're to talk about both sides of the team and how it works on both sides for us. So start off with the same for both sides. All projects must be registered in the GOSH Research and Innovation Office. Ideally, at this time as well, you should be helpful to copy in the ICH costings team into this, just so we can start working on the costings as soon as possible. This should include the registration form. And there's also a spreadsheet which includes all of the resources you're going to need for that project. For this, I think the recommendation is to allow 20 working days for the team to process your request and to set it up. With this 20 days, obviously bear in mind that has, the ICH team and the GOSH team can't start working on their areas until we receive that registration, and then we need 15 days as well. So it's worth bearing those kind of timelines in mind when you're submitting or think about submitting a costing for a grant. The R&D team then register your project on their database, and they issue like a unique reference number which can be used to refer to your project throughout the lifetime of that project, and they will notify the relevant finance teams of that award number and that has been registered in the system. And from that point in, that's when that battle for the ICH side of things, that's when our costings team then comes into play and starts working on that costing with the lead PI. So from our side of things, we're currently saying about 10 to 15 working days from the point we receive the approval to the point that we would finalise the costing with the PI. So during this time, we aim to work with the PI, costings team. So the costings team as well, I should mention, is Jasmine, which most of you probably know about. There's Radhika, who's the grants officer, and there's also Shanisha as well at the moment. So you probably hear from Radical or Shanisha when you first get the costings. They'll be working with you to generate that costings, applying their expertise of funded terms and conditions, making sure the costings included in the work tribe are reasonable, and trying to maximise the recovery from that costing. Once they're happy with that and the PI is happy with that as well, then that starts going up the approval chain within the team. So first of all, that would then go to the assistant research grants manager, so Jasmine, we did review the costing to make sure she'd be looking at the overhead recovery, for example. Is it in line with the terms of the funder? Are we happy with that as an institute? If the recovery is not high enough, or there's certain things that Jasmine might challenge you to speak to the PI directly, and work together to optimise the recovery on that grant, or to change the costings where needed. Once Jasmine's approved that, that then comes through to the institute management team for approvals. That'd be myself, Vicky, and JP Martinez, the assistant director for the institute. So from our point of view, we'd be looking at, can we facilitate that project within the institute? Is the overheads in line with our kind of objectives over the planning periods that we've been tasked to maximise and improve our recovery? So is that grant helping us to achieve that objective? Is it in line with our strategy? And also we'd be checking the portfolio of the academic to make sure, is the mix of funders that they're applying to what we would like as an institute? Is it just charity funding, or have they got a mix of research councils, for example? And we'd be reviewing that in some circumstances. In exceptional circumstances, once it's been approved by the institute team, it would go through to the faculty team for approval by the director of operations, and this might be where the recovery, the FEC recovery on the grant hasn't met the minimum threshold that we'd need as an institute. So for example, on a research council grant, we need at least 70% FEC recovery. And where it doesn't meet that, that would go through to Tansy, the director of operations, for her approval. And at this stage, we'd need to be able to support why we've approved it as an institute. And we'd normally like to give them pre-warning that this is going to come her way, so that it doesn't hold up the process when it gets to that point. And then it comes through to, once that's happened, it then goes through to the pre-award team. So there's quite a few steps in this whole stage. So it goes through to the pre-award team. They'll also be checking that the research innovation support team, the pre-award team, they're called, they'll be checking that the costings are in line with the eligible cost of that funder. Again, so there's lots of checks on that throughout the process. And they'll be able to raise queries or advise where we might be able to improve the overhead recovery on that grant. They'll ensure that the applications meet the Frascati definition of research. So where it does meet that, obviously sponsored research would be the right route for that application to go down, but it may be the case that if it doesn't meet that, it'd be better set up as an innovation project rather than a sponsored research project. They would review third-party arrangements to make sure we've got everything we need from the collaborators on that grant. So where we've got costings in the work tribe, have we got the quotes from them to support those costings and to make sure they're accurate. And that was it from the ICH side. So pass over to Wing to talk about things from the GOSH side.
So I'm going to go through the GOSH costings process. You might be happy to know that it's slightly less intense as the ICH counterparts. We have a few less approval processes and a few less parties involved. So essentially, once we've got that standardized email from the project registration team to say, here is a new project, please could you go away to your costings, that would automatically go to our research finance mailbox. From there, our research finance administrator will triage it out to the appropriate member of our team. So depending on the type of funder that you're applying to, it will basically dictate who it will go to. So I think typically for early researchers, a lot of the calls that you'll be applying to are non-commercial, not-for-profit entities. So the most common names that you're going to hear and that will be supporting you in this process will be Yomi, and myself. So just two names for you to get familiarised with. So we base the costings on the information that you've actually completed within your registration form. So it's really important to make sure that form is filled in as thorough as possible, because anything missing in that will delay essentially your entire costing process. So what happens is we'll basically populate the costings. We don't have a work tribe system that the ICH team has, so there's nothing fancy, but we do have, like, luckily a spreadsheet all formulated, which will capture everything that you will basically require. And once we're happy with everything, we will then return this back to the PI, along with any applicable queries that we have. So if we notice there's a few things that we need answered, we will raise those queries in that same email as well. So that's where it kind of then has to go through all, like, the discussions. Sometimes it could just be easily resolved via an email, or if there's quite a lot of queries, it's actually easier to do it via, like, a Teams or in-person catch-up or Zoom. So we will make that recommendation so that there's, like, less back and forth, especially where everyone's so busy. We want to kind of condense the time needed. Providing there are no more further queries that need to be resolved, we will then basically send you a finalized version of the costing. So essentially, when you get your initial draft, it will literally read draft scrolled across the first page. So once we're all happy, then it will literally read finalized, and you know that is basically the version of the costings that you need to be populating your grant application form against. So where a grant application has ICH and GOSH costs incurred, what we both parties would prefer as well is for each of us, in terms of ICH finance and GOSH finance, to have a copy of each other's costings that has been produced. So the lead organisation will always want all costs applicable to your project. So we would want a copy of the work tribe from ICH, and ICH would be the same. They would want a version of the GOSH costings available as well. So that's where you see that little kind of squiggly line in between each other to just show the interlink. So once everyone is basically happy with everything, the PI will then go away, populate their grant application form with all of the approved, agreed, finalised costs. The application form needs to then be sent off to the research registration team and the two finance teams involved. Preferably, they say they would like it 3 days ahead of your actual submission date. And this is basically to help with, if GOSH are the lead organisation in this, the research finance team would actually like to firstly cross-check your completed application form with the finalised version of the costings, just to make sure there's no last-minute surprises. And this just helps to condense the time needed when, obviously, you know, we're always hopeful for successful application in terms of reviewing the contracts, funding agreements, award letters. It just makes it so much easier when we've done this initial step at the beginning. So some application forms are done literally via hard copy submissions, or whether it's on a portal. Sometimes you might see that they actually require finance signatory from the lead organisation, or also a institute representation, like representative signature. So I've just included at the bottom of the flowchart who these individuals are, along with their email addresses, to kind of help guide. So for finance signatory, that will be myself or Craig. Craig is the head of research finance. And then in terms of getting like institute representative sign off, that will be Vanshri Patel, who is the head of R&I. So, yeah. So we've talked a lot about the registration form in the video and obviously in the slides here. So what I thought would be really useful is to actually show you like I've drafted something up of a good and bad version. I've only primarily focused on the finance sections of the registration form. I thought it would be useful for you guys to see side by side what we class as a bad version and a good version. So we'll just share screen. Actually, sorry.
Just sharing screen, sorry.
Yeah. So I've just mocked up two registration forms on the left-hand side. It's a good example, and I've kind of just put those areas in green to highlight that's good. And then on the other side, it's the bad example. So I thought it'd be useful to show you side by side what everything looks like. So this is basically someone's going for a 12-month grant and they've started filling in the application form. So as we can see here, the one in green, they've literally completed everything as per the headers, as per the questions. So they've even included the link. So that's useful because the finance teams will always want to double check for any terms and conditions that the funder asks about, along with any caps on certain budget areas. So we like to actually see this so we can do our QC ourselves. On the other side, though, they've literally just answered the very basic of, I'm just going for a GOSH CC funding call, but we don't know what this funding call is. We don't know when the deadline is. So we can't actually prioritize how urgent your actual request is, because obviously we literally have no dates. There are different sections here as well that talks about ICH support services, and it's just ticking obviously the relevant areas, and then also GOSH. So if I go down to the slightly lower parts, it's there where you need to start detailing what costs you actually require. Thanks. So as you can see, on the green side, everyone's put some really clear information. They've got the cost. They've literally selected the headers of who will purchase. So there's basically 2 drop-down sections for who will purchase, and it's only ever going to be GOSH or ICH on here. And then the VAT type as well. So it will read exempt or standard. So exempt is basically no VAT applicable to that area of cost. If you've selected standard, then we'll add on the extra 20% when we actually populate our costing.
Wait, how do you know that? There's actually a question that's come from BRC.
Yeah, that's gonna
Yeah,
be.
I always leave it as exempt. But
So on the HMRC web, on the government website, I need to actually I was literally trying to find a link that would be useful, because we've got well, you'll see later on the slides, we've got a useful resource link. Couldn't quite find it because I think they've removed it or changed it, but they used to have a list of things that would be technically classed as exempt for research specifically. General examples that I can provide you with is for laptops, so certain equipment that's used exclusively for research only and can't be applied for anything else, those will be classed as VAT exempt, so a laptop for research purpose only. Any specific equipment to do testing, for example, will be VAT exempt. But if you're buying like headphones, keyboards, anything like that, I'm sorry, that is going to be applied. Yeah. Any kind of lab, consumables, reagents, that's specific to medical research, so that would be VAT exempt as well. So it is
pretty helpful.
yeah, it's hard for me to say obviously like an exhaustive list. So we're going to try and find the actual government kind of issued website which kind of references these little bits and bobs. So I think that'll be helpful for everyone. But we would also do a little double check as well what we believe should be, because we'll have some type of knowledge built up. So we would always advise of the changes that we make against, if you've put in the exemption but we actually say it's standard, we'll kind of clarify on those.
And I see you put exempt for travel, so if it's travel for conferences, and again that would also be exempt.
Yes, yeah, so typically whenever you book, even like outside of research, the cost that you see kind of, if you're booking like train on train line or any flights, they'd give you an overall cost, so you can just put the overall cost in there instead of like applying back, because typically I don't think, unless they show on the very end receipt an invoice, it will only then break it down into the separate fares, but normally they just give you a whole cost. Yeah.
I know like ICA or UCL have done like a bite-sized session on tax and VAT before, which had examples of what would be exempt and what wouldn't be, and like the general principles behind it. So I can look to find that link afterwards.
I know as well, a lot of, like, in terms of the higher education institutes on their intranets, they do tend to have a page that talks about like VAT exemption. I'm not sure if I've seen it, because I haven't obviously gone through the UCL intranet, but I think there might be a page, so we could actually add that onto the useful links as well. Yeah.
Does it matter whether it's from GOSH or UCL?
No, it depends on the research itself. So if they just badge as research and then class it whether it's VAT exempt or not. Yeah. So yeah, it's just a case of making sure that on the registration form is literally as what the headers are asking, that you fill in those all the fields relative. So another example here that I thought was good to highlight is, sometimes some people just don't think about the fuller picture, and we obviously want to make sure it's cost recovered, and obviously you're not personally going to be out of pockets as well. So I use the example of if certain funding calls allow for conferences, training and development, and they will actually provide you like budget for all the travel, accommodation, subsistence. So on this side, the red side, somebody's only just thought about flights for an international conference. They've not taken into consideration, oh, well, where will I be staying when I'm there? What subsistence costs? So this person here has actually made sure they accounted for everything. So that's what you want to also think about as well.
Also for 8 years project, that's a bit difficult because sometimes you put 20K for traveling for the PI and the research assistant for the next 5 years. It's difficult to say I'm gonna be to this conference in 3 years' time.
Yes, exactly. So it depends on the funding call you're going for. Some of them will be a bit more specific, especially when it's like 12-month grants or 24-month grants. That's easier to predict, obviously. When it comes to others that are longer term, in terms of longer duration term, we can discuss about what we think would be appropriate. So if you had a range of different conferences in mind, we can obviously just summate those costs and have it as a one-liner, but we'll have those discussions. I think the main thing is just the communication between all parties. So the PI requesting for the costs and the finance teams who's actually populating the costs. So it's kind of the same. It's just going through the main points to highlight, just making sure all the information is in there. So, you know, with the training one, yes, they put training. Yes, they have put in that it's going to be incurred at GOSH, is exempt, and the cost. However, this example I've just put down there is, well, you put training and it's a massive cost. It's like nearly 12.5 grand. So we would not naturally query that as like, what kind of training? Is this a typo situation? But then on this green hand side, we've actually got the name of the course, so we can actually cross-check to make sure there's just no typos involved. Yeah. And then there'll be some sections at the bottom. So this is the same for, there'll be a GOSH one, and then just below there's an ICH that talks about actual staff members involved that you're trying to get funded. So for existing staff members, we need their full name and literally just the start date, end date, and what their time that's going to be on the project itself. That's here. So with exact staff members, so from both GOSH and ICH side, with their names, we can actually check them on the system to correctly calculate how much their cost will be. So we'll be able to check for like their pay, fine points, etc. And then obviously, if it's kind of going into future financial years, both of our parties have like an inflationary uplift to account for future pay rises that might come up. As for new staff members, so brand new roles, which you don't have or just any role that you don't have a specific staff member assigned already that you know will be working on it, so long as you provide us with the name of the role, the band that you want it at, grade for ICH, and then start, end, and the FT there, we can actually populate it. So with GOSH, we typically are standard, unless you specifically clarify which spine you would like on. We tend to go in at the midpoint, but I know with ICH you go at the top point, isn't it? Yeah. So that's just something to bear in mind. I know that sometimes it depends on who you're trying to attract into this role. So you might want to say, actually, could you cost it at the top end so that we can factor in that there's enough budget to actually hire someone at that top end. Amy?
Has a question. Someone mentioned to me recently it's possible to cost a range.
So if
which I've not never done before, I've always kind of done either the dependent budget. But that would be helpful because it obviously depends who you have applying. It kind of avoids the whole having to recost and via money and stuff like that, which I've had to do in the past.
Yeah, exactly. So if you wanted to get an illustration of like different bands, how much it would be, you can include that information on here. Maybe just include a subsidiary note just to say, could you cost all of these?
But can you so how can you put that? So I know you could give me an example of the different costs, but can you then put a range in the budget? Do you see what I mean? Or would you just put the top of the range?
In terms of actually submitting your grant. So it depends on what the funders allow. I think a lot of the time they want to actually get like a specific cost opposed to a range. So in that sense, so long as you're within their funding core allowance, I would recommend going for the top end, because it's always better to
too much money.
Put as much in, yes, exactly, than putting not enough and then trying to find where you can meet that shortfall. So yeah, this is just basically like a quick example of what we would class as a really good registration form that will take significantly less time to actually kind of populate and then negotiate with yourself, versus one that's literally just going to delay the whole entire process. And it will, obviously the end goal is to make sure you submit before the application deadline. So to get it done ahead of time, it's always most favorable. So just literally going with the headers would be most appreciated. And if we go back to slides. Yeah. So now we're just going to talk about kind of application outcome and then what happens after you're awarded.
Okay, so yeah, now we're at the stage where we know the outcome of the application. This will either be communicated to the lead PI, the research innovation and support team, or the ICH costings team. But it's important that once we get the outcome, that is communicated to everyone involved in the costing and the application, you know, irrespective of whether it's successful or not. So we keep, you know, in the ICH team, we keep a log of all the applications and what's outstanding, so we know what we need to chase and what we don't need to chase. So obviously, if we got an outcome, it's good to know that, you know, hopefully it's been successful, but also takes it off our register of what we need to be speaking to research services about. So once that's been communicated to the ICH costings team, we'll be taking that forward in terms of right, so that will then come down to the ICH finance team. Okay. That'll come down to the ICH costings team, and when it comes down to us, the checks that we'll be looking at will be looking at the budget that was awarded compared to what we submitted. Generally, this is the same. There's not ever normally a reduction, but in the cases where there is a material reduction in the awarded budget, we'd be looking at, speaking to PI themselves, looking at, is this project still viable on this reduced budget? You know, and if it is, what cuts or where are we going to find those savings against what we submitted? Is it on staff cost or operating expenditure? And we'd take it from there if it is still viable. Obviously, we need to look at the overhead recovery with the new costings. That's still supported by the industry, for example. So there'll be a few discussions at that point if it is materially different, but hopefully that won't happen. Within the ICH team as well, we've then arranged the risk assessment, which is done with the lab management team and Stuart Law. So we'd get the ball rolling on that, and that's one of the documents that need to be completed before we can set up the project. And once we're happy with the awarded budget and how it's going to be delivered, the project's going to be delivered, we'd then notify research innovation and support team that we're happy for this to be progressed. And then they'll start taking that forward with their checks that they'd be doing. The checks that they'd be doing are generally looking at the work trial budget. Obviously, within work trial, there's a lot of categories for costs. That doesn't flow, you know, there's not that many categories when it comes to actually the project and how the project's set up with the budget. So they'd look at consolidating some of the work trial costs into some of the task costs that is on Axiom. So that the budget is on our reporting system. They'll be reviewing the documentation related to the awards. So, you know, the R&D approval, once it's come through, the ethics approval, the risk assessment, and they'll be making sure that we've received all of these before the project can be set up. So we can't go any further at this point. They'll be reviewing the terms and conditions of the award to make sure that it's in line with UCL's terms and conditions and regulations. For example, some funders wouldn't want us to publish our findings perhaps, whereas UCL as a university needs to be able to share these findings. So UCL would be pushing back on these terms and negotiating new terms for the award. And that's why it's important the research team do that rather than awards being accepted within the local finance team.
So is that the post-awards team?
That's the pre-awards team.
Pre-awards team.
Yeah, pre-award.
Okay.
Yes, that's still setting up a project. That's still the pre-awards team. So they'd also be carrying out their due diligence at this point. So they'd be looking at the whether we want to be accepting money from this funder. are there any like reputational risks from accepting the money or from this project? Credit checks on the funder, especially if it's a new funder we haven't had before, they'd be wanting to look at, you know, how reliable they are for giving us that money. And once they're happy with all this, they'd accept the award on behalf of the institution. So we, you know, like I said, the local finance team can't do that. If there's subcontractors involved, they would be liaising with the UCL contracts team. So if any of you have had the experience of this so far, that's obviously where we would experience or be likely to experience significant delays with the project setup from the UCL side of things. Contracts team are, from what I hear, very under-resourced, and like the volume of applications or contract requests that are going into that team, it's just growing and growing each year. And I think UCL have outsourced that resource now to the contracts team. I think they still struggle there, and you know, resource problems there as well. So that's where the delays are likely to happen from a UCL side of things. Once they've got contracts in place and all the documents in place, that's the point at which the project can be set up. And that generally happens pretty quickly. I think there's, within a day, every 2 hours, there's the opportunity to set up a project in the system. So as long as there's no technical issues, the project should normally be able to be set up pretty quickly once all the documents have been confirmed. So that's it from ICH's side. So
in terms of GOSH, what happens is once obviously you've received the outcome, we're always hopeful that, you know, it's successful because everyone's putting so much time and effort into it. So once the PI gets obviously the grant award letter and or funding agreement, so it really depends, the type of documentation received will depend on the funder themselves. So if GOSH are the lead organisation, what happens is Research Finance will review the documents received. So essentially, we're basically cross-checking to make sure that the awarded funds are in line with what you put in your application. And if there's any kind of shortfalls or just cost discrepancies, we will flag that directly in the documents query at all. We'll also be reviewing all the finance terms and conditions, or the clauses as well. In terms of the rest of the like non-finance elements, this will be reviewed by the contract team to make sure that we're happy with everything. So yeah, negotiations will take place where required. If there's nothing wrong with the grant award letter, that's not that common. We tend to have some type of query. At that point, once everyone's happy, so funder's happy, yourselves are happy, we're happy, then we'll basically progress on to getting it all signed off. And then also double checking that if your actual grant has ICH costings, we'll arrange for a subcontract as well. So a lot of these pieces of work, we just kind of, the finance teams will do in the background, so you don't have to worry too much about it, but it's just mostly for your information on what happens. In terms of getting your actual cost center and getting access to your grants, so what happens is we actually need to wait for the R&D governance team to send their green light approval, because obviously there's other processes that they need to make, well, they need to complete to make sure everything's fine with the project. So only once we have their green light, then we progress on to opening your cost center. There are some extenuating circumstances where it might take a little bit of time. So finance will essentially do a risk assessment of how likely is it that this project won't go ahead. In the event that is very unlikely, we could then get the cost center raised ahead of governance approval being granted. And that depends on how urgently you need to access your grants and able to start your projects. In this standardized email that you will get, once we've opened the cost center, the PIs will receive a standardized email from the research finance team. And within that is basically confirming what your cost center is, along with providing key information on how to get you set up as an authorizer, and asking you who will be basically placing orders for services and goods on the trust procurement system. So we'll have all of those information and pointers within that email, and that tends to basically come from our research finance admin. So because we've obviously know that there's not really an SOP that's widely available on the trust intranet, we are in process in terms of the finance team trying to update this email template to make sure we include the key information that we believe would be useful to you guys. So if there are any things that you think would be useful to highlight that we don't already do, please do let me know, and then I'll take that feedback away and then we'll incorporate it into our standardized email. In terms of what happens with managing your grants after, so the finance teams are basically here to support you, but ultimately the responsibilities of the grant does fall upon the awardee. So I do recommend, as a top tip, is essentially to make sure you try and keep a basic tracker of your spend, because essentially what the finance team does to then double check how much spend versus budget you have left is dictated by the information that's on our general ledger. So if there's any costs that have not yet come through, so you know, if we receive any invoices late from suppliers or they've not reached us for us to know that and to capture on the ledger, we won't have this information at hand. However, as a researcher, you will be aware of what you have purchased, what services you've engaged with, and you know what service providers you're also talking with. So you having a basic tracker, all you need to really denote is cost associated, when the purchase took place, with who as well. So long as you have that information, when we have kind of like grant budget catch-ups, we can then compare your information versus what's on the ledger and then account for these things as well. So I'm a bit conscious of time, so we're going to maybe speed through essentially this part.
Yeah, so I think obviously Wings covered the first top tip in terms of costing at a higher point, especially, you know, that's what we'd like to aim for in ICH. It's much more preferable to do that and then have some money left over to account, you know, to create a buffer for inflation if need be, rather than to cost lower and then a point higher, in which case you then might have to look at the duration that you point that person to. Allowing 3 to 6 months after the award start date. So this is where I think this is quite happens a fair amount of time from what I hear from the costings team is that, you know, with like people starting work, like researchers starting work on the project, you know, you'll hope that they can start, you know, within a month of the award being created in the system or the start date of the award. But due to the processes in that research and innovation services and in the R&D office, it's more realistic to assume that project will actually start 3 to 6 months after the award start date. So that's when I'd recommend looking to get researchers on your project where viable. We always need to include PI and co-I time, even if the funder won't pay for these. Just from an industry perspective, we need to report on the input, or, you know, the researchers' activity on grants, regardless of whether they pay for it or not. Being aware of the funder conditions, so some of the funders prescribe to us what they will pay for and what they won't pay for. So, for instance, research councils pay for 80% of the full economic cost to the institution. So that includes the direct costs and indirect costs, but we can't include inflation in the costings for research councils as well, because if it is awarded, they would award us an inflationary amount at the end, which often isn't at the level that UCL needs. Charities, when you pay for direct costs, we would receive government income to help support the university in carrying out that research, and that's known as charity QR. Given enough notice to the teams, obviously, like I said, the team's very stretched at the moment. There's the volume coming in is growing each year, and I think the resource, from what I hear, the resource in the ICH team has decreased. You know, I think they used to have a lot more staff in the finance team than they do now. So obviously the demands on the team is a lot greater than it used to be. So allowing enough time to get the costings through would help. And considering whether that is applicable to your costings as well, which I think we've covered already, and the tracker as well. So common mistakes with the inflation, not factoring inflation where the funder would pay for it. Obviously, inflation is very high at the moment, so further down the line in your project, you know, we'd be, if we're not factoring it appropriately, then there'd be shortfalls in the budget, and you struggle to pay for as many things you'd like to have done when you initially costed the budget or the project. We do not, as you know, in the ICH team, it doesn't happen as often as it used to do, but we receive like the work trial costs before we receive the R&D registration number, and obviously then that delays the process slightly. On the work trial costing system, internal deadlines are sometimes used rather than funded deadlines. So it's important to use the funded deadlines, and the grant period and the contract periods are not always aligning. So where the award, says the start of the year, but the project's been set up for 3 months later, if the contract in the, the employee contract in the costing was for the full term, obviously that would need to be adjusted for the slight delay in the project being set up. So sometimes they don't align.
There's quite an easy resolution for that last point, and that's essentially if we observe this discrepancy in terms of timeframes quite early on, we can go straight back to the funder, just ask them if they could reissue a letter just to confirm that they're happy for new project start dates for the grant, or we can also ask them for a no cost extension and just explain that the project started later than intended. So it's quite easy resolution for that. So we have the useful links that before we actually circulate these slides as resource, we think we'll just add some more kind of links onto there. So that will include, so right now we've got the GOSH R&D information page and also the UCL one, but I'll try and find the one about the VAT exemption and things like that to add on. And now Q&A, down to you guys.
Yeah, I don't know, the PI pro-I times, is there, how much time do we include?
So from an ICH perspective, we'd like, for principal investigator, we'd like a minimum of 12.5% on the grant. And with OI, I think it's 7.5%. We'd like cost of the grant.
And that's presumably dictated by most of the institute rather than, because sometimes funders say whatever's reasonable amount of time to deliver the work.
Yeah, I think that's institute driven. I think the institute feel that that's like a reasonable amount of time to include on the grant.
And another thing is that sometimes the actual funder, so on their page for their funding call, they'll actually specify these things as well. Yeah.
So I've got two questions. The first one is, one of the problems we often run up against is you kind of get your grant letter and then you go through the kind of grant setup period. That takes quite a long time at various stages, often sometimes for research governance, sometimes for other reasons. And then you can't request to advertise a job until you've got the grant code. Mm-hmm. So that's often the reason it takes kind of several months, and often you end up starting the grant because you want to get your grant code. You then can't employ your person, they end up not starting for 3 months. You kind of end up in this situation a lot with kind of a discrepancy between the person and the kind of end date and start date of the grant. Is there a kind of ways we can speed it up? It's often, is there a way that HR would allow you to?
Or from a finance perspective, there is like ways that recently been introduced to help get around this. So they're known as like research bridging accounts. Mm-hmm. These are used elsewhere in UCL, so it's a process which we know works, and we've just implemented it in population health. So where the award has been accepted and confirmed, and there's like little risk that the project won't go ahead, you can speak to me and my team, and we can set up a project for this. School finance would need to see the award letter and know that there's little risk that, to confirm to them there's little risk the project won't go ahead. Once that's project set up, we can employ the member of staff on that project code for however long it takes to set up. And then once it is set up, those costing get charged back to the grant, and there's no impact on that code. Obviously, there has to be little, where we do that, if the costing don't get recharged back to the grant, that stays within the institute, and that's the risk we want to avoid. So we just have to be like little risk with that.
That'd be really helpful, particularly because that can be a problem. And then my second question was about because I've got a few grants where I've got GOSH costs, like so consumables have gone to GOSH. But I don't have access to the e-procurement system, even though I'm a GOSH employee. So because obviously I use like WorkDrive and all the other UCL systems. So are we supposed to have access to that if we're the grant holder? Or I'm not doing the ordering, but it would be helpful to see what's going on with the grant. Yeah, in terms of what's being spent, etc.
Oh, so it's just kind of knowing how much you've got left in the budget. Yeah. So unfortunately for GOSH side, we don't have a fancy system that UCL has where it kind of really shows, you literally just type in a few details and get the budget code, code, and then you can see exactly your budget versus how much is to be spent. So in the finance team, there are a range of finance managers and some management accountants, and we basically divvied up our entire portfolio. So there will be an individual looking after specific portfolios. And then essentially at the research finance mailbox, if you email the query there, our finance administrator will triage your request to the appropriate person. They'll then basically just manually populate to check how much your budget was versus how much you've spent so far. So we'll basically provide you with like a little spreadsheet report of that.
Okay.
It's a question online. Who do we contact within GOSH to see how much of our research funds have been used up, and whether invoices have been paid? Is it the generic email address?
Yes.
And Nida's kindly provided that in chat.
Yeah, so if you contact the research finance shared mailbox, and then it will just get triaged to the right personnel looking after your study.
Thank you.
Yeah. Will you have any like a agreement with UCL ICH if your funding is shared between GOSH and UCL?
Yeah, so what happens is the lead institute, irrespective of which party, if there's certain budget areas that's awarded to the other counterparts, we basically have to initiate a subcontract. So it's essentially a sub-award, a sub-award to basically say, this is how much has been agreed. They'll have the terms and conditions as well. It will have a financial appendix, which actually details out the budget that's actually assigned. And then we sign it off, and then it's just a matter of invoicing to transfer funds over.
So is there any condition like which cost go to GOSH and which cost should go to UCL?
Yeah, and that would have been captured at your initial costing stage where you fill out the form, and then you select if it's going to be a GOSH or an ICH cost.
So who decides that? Is it like a funding call, or the investigator who is conducting research is up to them, or is it finance that this cost should come to GOSH and this cost should go to UCL or something like that? So
typically at the beginning, the researcher would have populated their costings and established where they would have been incurred. So that's kind of that stage, a very, very early stage.
I have a few questions, but the first one is the percentage that you bring it up when you mentioned 12.5% for PI and 7.5% for COI. I mean, it's fine if you're applying for a large of money, something like 1 or 2 million, but sometimes you're applying for something which is the cap is, let's say 100K, and you have 1 PI and 2 COI. And if you want to have 12.5% and 7.5% for each, you will end up watching each other and not having money to spend in the lab. You know what I mean? Or hire a postdoc or something. So I guess you need to have a sort of an able, and based on the, the size of the grant, you dictate what is the percentage. It's reasonable, but 12.5% for 2 million is reasonable, but for £100,000 it's not reasonable, because it's quite a substantial pot of money going just to the salary and not for the research. And the second point is regarding the inflation and all of the costs not adding up, because that's a title of the talk. And if you look at the funding bodies, they didn't increase the cap. So if they were giving 200K for 3 years, 10 years ago, they're still doing that exactly the same, but the salary went up, consumable went up, and people are in a really difficult situation. So I guess we need to look at some other ways to helping researcher to be able to do the job, and all of this percentage that university is looking at, understand, that side of the argument as well. But I guess.
But just to clarify, if the person, so say it's a senior collaborator and they're core funded, which means they're like a tenured person, then you wouldn't then be asking for those costs, right? So as in they would be costed at zero cost.
That'd be the PI be 12.5% ideally.
But say you've got a COI who's well, this is what I never understand about salary, like where it actually goes. It's like imaginary money. And because if that person's already fully paid, say they're a professor who's tenured, but you want to put on as a co-investigator, and you say they're 5% or 7.5% or whatever, I think you don't then incur the cost on that grant, do you? Because if you do, then where does that money go? Does it just go into?
Yeah, so that's so where it's directly incurred, that's where that staff member's time would be coded directly against the grant. where it's directly allocated, we are recovering those costs, but those costs come into us as overheads. So you would have your core staff costs, then you'd have overheads come in to help offset those core staff costs rather than them being funded directly against the grant. So it's like, you know, it's funding for
So a
that
tenured person would go in the DA costs. So a tenured person would, a kind of person whose salary is covered will go in the DA costs.
Generally like professors or the lead academics would normally have to go through DA. It's like the research, your project specific post, then that would go through the.
Then you shouldn't have to pay for them.
Yeah, I think so. I think the confusion I think often comes on the charity grants that those aren't paid, and people tend to list every single collaborator they ever had as co-investigator. So UCL would count that, but then it's not charged to the funder. And I think then the challenges are, say, for an MRC grant, if you include the same list of people, then it's eaten up. The budget top line would include the DA time and DI time as the top line, and then that would be eaten up by all the 5% for investigators. So I suppose, is there a process to negotiate that down? Because if somebody wants to, politically, you need to include somebody as a co-investigator, but they're a professor whose salary, even at 5%, would be like 200K over a 5-year period.
So there is, I believe there's process, you know, where it is below by the institute level that we'd want, there is, you know, we can negotiate that, and if it is strategically important, that grant for the institute and for the academic, I think that would then go to Helen for approval of that grant. So there is potential, but it has to be approved by the director of the institute. But I completely understand the logic and your point. And then maybe, you know, there may be processes in the costing team already to reflect that. I'm not too sure on the specifics just yet for the costings in that situation, but I believe don't put collaborators. Nice choice.
Can I ask you a related question? So you mentioned about expense recovery. So I'm right that we should be targeting at a minimum of 30%.
Yes.
Overhead recovery.
Yeah.
So, but how is that recovery applied to staff? Because I noticed that if you apply it to a research assistant, a postdoc, overheads are applied, but a technician, they aren't applied. So what's the distinction between an overhead is applied to and the other isn't applied to?
So the overheads on the grant are only applied to what would be classified as research FTE. Technicians don't fall under that. I actually only looked at this year. I can't tell you the
pooled service, so they're not working specifically exclusively on that research project. You need them, but they're obviously doing work for a range of different projects. So they're not called a research system.
Yeah, technicians are recovered through. There's an infrastructure pool overhead amount that's applied to a grant. It's where you recover the cost of a technician. But there's research FTE, which I can't remember the exact criteria, but that's the FTE that directs the overheads on a grant.
If I could just rewind a little bit, which will help answer the queries that you raised. So obviously everything that John's spoken about is kind of like ICH side. In terms of like the PI percentage time to include, it does also depend on the project itself. So if I was to use the example of like an early research going for NIHR fellowship, where you go for that type of grant, normally they kind of request for either 1 FTE of their own time or 0.6 or 0.8. So it's literally the percentage of the PI quote unquote time would depend on the project itself. So that's why I thought it was just good to highlight. So it's not just to say that, you know, if a researcher who's going for this grant is working full time on it, that's the only percentage that they're allowed to include. And then there's obviously certain plans where you mentioned about inflation. So essentially, if we decide to engage with that particular funder and say, yes, we're going to accept it, the institutes both independently have to accept that there's going to be a slight risk of inflation and that their budget's not enough. So that's why it's important that once it's awarded, we had the periodic catch-ups together. So in terms of finance teams and the PI, just to understand their project, to see if there's any shortfalls, if there's any underspends anywhere that can be repurposed into other costs, into other budget areas, or whether the shortfall is looking to be quite significant. And then we can advise that, okay, we kind of need to look for a plan B now, whether you should go for another funding pool to make up for the shortfall in costs. So it's important to just keep the communication, that open link, because that's the best way that we can manage it. So with NIHR grants as well, they literally only award funding as per that application year. So they don't account for like, oh, your project might start in 2 years' time or a year's time, and agenda for change rates completely changed. They'll only ever award it as per the application kind of time frame, submission year. So that's a risk that the institutes have to basically accept as well, that we could be seeing a shortfall.
I think there's a question online, if I can ask a related question just before we go to that. So I was at a project management course maybe about 2 years ago, and it was an external person that was brought in and asked everybody in the room how much of a contingency budget they built in the grants. And everyone just looked at each other and said, nobody's ever mentioned the contingency budget at all. And that's not accepted really by the funding bodies. So, but should we be looking to build in a percentage contingency into the grants so that would then cover for inflation and things like that? I mean, I guess people do that with travel, with consumables, with different things, but is there a minimum level that we should be looking to build in? Because essentially, to capture the information on the form is saying, give us the detailed information with real costs, whereas actually what you need to do is budge that a little bit to give you a wiggle room, if that makes sense. Is there a percentage that you would like us to build in?
So I don't know if there's a set percentage, but what I would advise is that for staff posts, to just cost it at the higher end. So if you don't have a specific person already in mind and you just have a banding, I would, if it's so long as it's within your funding bracket, just go for the higher end instead of the midpoint, because at least that gives a bit of a buffer as well. So there's little changes like that we can account for.
What are the questions? What happens to that salary if it's not used?
So a lot of funders actually are quite specific, where they're happy for non-pay budgets to be repurposed. So if you've got underspend on your non-pay, they're happy for you to repurpose it into paying for any pay costs that have actually gone higher. They're not quite happy with the opposite. So if there is any underspend,
no cost extension normally.
To see if your project needs a little bit of extra time and you've got underspend on your pay costs and you want to extend, you basically want to increase the duration, that could be something, literally as Valerie pointed out, to just do a no cost extension to say, oh, we have this. Are you happy for us to just extend it for another couple of months?
So one last question online. It's like
people that, so I did have my hand up before.
Sorry,
it's a practical issue that we have for your work tribe. If we don't have a UCL honorary contract, we can't access work tribe. So to do those subcontracts, it's a real issue for the NIHR junior fellows who don't have honorary contracts, but they might have a cross in. I don't know where you can take that forward for anyone. There's an issue that we do have.
Yeah, I'm not too sure on that specific.
And to get on the contract is notoriously difficult for GOSH, and this would bring a lot of money in for you guys to go overheads. Again, the junior fellows aren't. But it's just meant to take forward to somewhere for a barrier we have for work trying.
Okay, so maybe something that we can take forward through the highlights.
The online question is, if we're partnering with another university or other organisation on research, would the same subcontracting system apply? AKA if GOSH is the lead organisation.
Yeah, so we would subcontract a lot of the time. There are times where if it's going to be such minimal costs being incurred elsewhere, we might just say, do you know what, I'm not sure there's any point in actually doing a full subcontract, because that can be quite lengthy. So if it's a very, very minimal cost and it's only one single area, it's likely to be a one-off as well. We'll just ask for them to invoice us, but we'll just communicate that. But if there's obviously a range of different costs that will be incurred elsewhere, then obviously we would initiate that subcontract.
Perfect.
I've just got a hand up.
You have your hand up?
Hi, I just wanted to add to that sometimes you have collaborators on a grant application, like an NIHR grant, and if they're a collaborator, then we might have to do that via a collaboration agreement. You know, the transfer of funds.
Quite quiet there. I think what you were saying is that depending on the situation, you might need to rely on a collaboration agreement. Is that correct, Andrew? So
Yeah.
it might be specific to different agreements and different collaborators.
So I guess the activity involved between the parties will dictate the type of agreement that's required.
So, for example, like in clinical trials, you discuss about funding, costing, grants, and all those. Whether does the CRN funding comes in this whole bit in this funding?
So I think that's slightly outside of this kind of seminar. So when it comes to if your project has a clinical research, a trial, that's a whole other session that's needed, because then we'll talk about, you know, if it's commercial, non-commercial, how you cost a commercial, how you cost a non-commercial.
SOCATs.
Yeah, so that is a much bigger session that needs definitely a whole hour.
The SOCATs is still relevant to this a bit, isn't it? 'Cause that can be outside.
Yeah, so if there is a session that's required to talk about if you have a non-commercial clinical trial, then I'm open to discussing. Let's have a
Even any
section.
other, there are some studies, aren't there, where there's non-trial studies where you still may need to complete a SOCAT, or you might need to kind of fill in a negative, a blank SOCAT or whatever.
Oh, to say that there is no SOCAT requirement or cost. Okay.
The
So
SOCAT is
typically
only
a
if you
SOCAT is
trial.
actually specific for when you need actually a clinical trial.
But-
That's
but-
what a SOCAT's.
So I'm doing an observational study. and
Yeah.
I had to do a SOCAT for that.
Oh, okay, so maybe it's just terminology. So observational study, that can also have a SOCAT involved as well. Yes, yeah. But yeah, we would need a whole other session, probably longer than an hour as well in that area.
Perfect, guys. Well, thank you for joining. And I'm sure if you have any questions, you can refer them to the table. And then don't forget, there's the networking session. If people want to stay for some drinks and nibbles.
Yeah, and if you could don't mind grabbing the QR code if you want to give a
Yeah,
bit of
please,
feedback
please
as
give
well.
us some feedback. Yeah.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Bring in John, please.
Thank you very much.
Laura,
So yeah.
see my message?
Yes, Dowda.
Thank you.
What facilities?
Right, so.
For seeing patients.
It's coming back to
Nothing too much.
DC.